All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Financial Manual Overview. I am Brandon Keffer, Director of AmeriCorps Finance at YouthBuild USA, and I'm joined today by Teresa Quinones and Bethany Ari Clerico, Financial Grants Managers on the AmeriCorps team. So we will be your hosts for today's webinar, and I encourage you all to connect with your assigned financial manager should you wish to discuss any of today's information more in depth. So while we will be pointing to a few written and video resources today, we do want to emphasize that your biggest resource is your AmeriCorps Financial Manager. And part of our role is to support you in the implementation of this work. So we're happy to answer any questions along the way. So while we won't be fielding any questions during today's presentation, we do welcome you to reach out should you be left with any questions after today's session and once you've had a chance to take a look at some of our new resources. And finally, you can expect an email follow-up after today's webinar with a copy of the presentation and any resources that we mentioned today. So we want to get a sense of who is joining us today. So I'm going to launch a poll here. So the majority of YouthBuild's AmeriCorps programs have registered for this webinar, and I know our team has been connecting with plenty of new fiscal staff, new programs who are just looking to get acquainted with the in and outs of the grants. So in the poll, just take a moment and let us know how long you've been involved with the AmeriCorps grant. Are you completely new to the grant? Have you been doing this about a year or less? 2 to 4 years, 5+ years, or I lost track, too long? All right, excellent. So that tracks. I think we've got a handful of new folks, some fiscal hotshots that have been doing this for a while. So it's good to have a mix. So I'm going to end that poll and share out the results just so you can see. All right. So our agenda today is to distill down the fiscal management of the YouthBuild AmeriCorps grant into 3 areas. First, financial management. So providing an overview or an understanding of the financial systems and written policies that need to be in place at your organization just to ensure good stewardship of this federal resource. Budgets will provide an overview of our budget policies, the administrative process for creating the AmeriCorps budget, as well as making any needed modifications. I'd say many of our programs are currently drafting or revising budgets for the current 22-23 grant year. So this might be a good refresher if you're currently preparing the budget for the new grant year. And finally, the AmeriCorps reimbursement process. We'll walk you through the monthly monitoring process where support documentation is provided to YouthBuild USA, and then your AmeriCorps financial manager, which is us, reviews for any potential issues of noncompliance before we issue those disbursements or payments. So we will be providing a somewhat condensed overview of what written resources are available in the manual, as well as focusing on some key takeaways that we'd just like to emphasize about the process. So there are 2 main objectives that we'd like to accomplish today. The first is for you all to simply locate the updated version of the AmeriCorps Financial Management Manual. This is your main written resource for understanding how to carry out the fiscal management of the award. And the second goal is to really prepare you for the current 22-23 grant year. This means giving you the information you need to finalize the budget and to prepare you for that monthly reimbursement process. All right. So let's go ahead and take care of that first objective and connect you to the resources and the updated financial management manual. So we'll throw a link into the chat. This is to the AmeriCorps Fiscal Management Resources webpage. All right, so this is your one-stop shop. It's got all of our policies, instructions, guidance, templates, video resources. Anything that we've referenced today is going to be located on this webpage. Now, I know we have plenty of new fiscal staff we're working with who are also joining us today, who are just looking out for resources to just get acquainted with the grants. So please visit this webpage, bookmark it, review some of these resources, as much of our content has just been refreshed by the team this month. So this is an excellent entry point into the grant. So you'll find the manual at the top of our webpage. So why would you bother to read this manual? It's probably your best resource for understanding how to remain in compliance with the grant. The key update to the manual this year is that it now consolidates all of these written policies, all of our instructions, any necessary checklists, guidance, as well as talking about the administrative flow for things such as the budgeting and reimbursement process. So this manual will really serve as a guide to help you manage the financial relationship between your organization and your AmeriCorps financial manager, which is us at YouthBuild USA. All right, so to help promote this updated resource, our team had sent out a reminder to our individual portfolio of fiscal staff at AmeriCorps programs, inviting them to the webinar and an opportunity to win some AmeriCorps prizes. So fiscal staff had until the end of the day yesterday to find our team cat. We call him Felix, the fiscal feline, who is hidden within the manual. So after each of our sections, Bethany, Teresa, and I will announce a winner that was randomly selected from each of our portfolios who found Felix, and you can expect an email from us sometime this week on details on how to claim your AmeriCorps gear. And so while the deadline to find Felix is over, you can still take a look in the manual, see if you can find him. We might make this a yearly tradition. So if you didn't find him this year, you may have a chance as we gear up for grant startup next year. And I'll connect you to one more resource before I jump into today's content, and that is the AmeriCorps Fiscal Crash Course. So you can find a link to this on our resources webpage, along with the manual. So the Fiscal Crash Course is a video playlist. It's available on YouTube, and this provides an overview of much of the content within the written fiscal manual. So if you're more of a visual learner, an auditory learner, you may want to start here. And as we cover today's content, we'll continue to link back to some of these specific videos. So today's webinar is an overview of much of the manual. So if there are specific topics you just feel like you need more information on, you'll find a more in-depth review in these videos. All right, so let's move into financial management requirements. So I'll be highlighting two sections of the manual as it relates to the overall management of the award. The first is the financial management survey policy. You'll likely recognize this survey as one of those fiscal action items for grant startup. So you may have just recently completed and submitted this along with your 22-23 draft AmeriCorps budget. And after that, I'll give a reminder about the grant expenditure period. Or in other words, the period of time in which you can incur and bill expenses under each AmeriCorps grant year. So let's first conceptualize the relationship between your organization and YouthBuild USA. So YouthBuild USA is the prime grantee of this AmeriCorps National Direct Award, and we then subgrant funds to local YouthBuild affiliates via the AmeriCorps subgrantee agreement. And it's through this agreement that all of those federal uniform guidance requirements from the Office of Management and Budget, AmeriCorps terms and conditions, and then YouthBuild USA requirements flow down to your program at the subgrantee level. And so what that agreement essentially says is that if you, meaning the grantee, engage in certain activities during a certain period of time, then we, which is the US government, will reimburse you for certain costs incurred while engaging in that activity. So to put it in other words, you need to have the financial systems and internal controls in place so that you can distinguish between costs that are attributable to this specific award versus costs that are not attributable to this award. And so does YouthBuild USA's responsibility as the prime grantee to monitor the activities of all subrecipients just to ensure that the award is being used for the authorized purposes and it's meeting all of those applicable rules and regulations. So that is why the AmeriCorps grant is a monthly cost reimbursement grant, where the monitoring is occurring on a monthly basis in order to mitigate any issues of noncompliance prior to the disbursement of funds. So our first step of each 3-year grant cycle is to evaluate a subrecipient's risk for noncompliance. And we accomplish this through the Financial Management Survey. So first thing to know is that this is a requirement prior to the reimbursement of funds under this new 22-23 grant year. There was a deadline of September 30th to provide this information, but just know if your program is yet to complete this, your AmeriCorps financial manager will be connecting with you at some point this month to either collect that survey or to help finalize that survey. So the full survey is required for the first year of participation within each 3-year grant period, meaning that once this is taken care of this year, you'll only need to complete a certification for all of those following years. And then this certification simply informs us if there were any significant changes that have occurred either within your written policies or procedures at your organization. And so in fact, grant year 22-23 is the first year of this new 3-year AmeriCorps grant cycle. All right, so why are you making us do this? So it's really to establish that the organization has implemented the internal controls necessary to properly manage federal funds. So you would likely have these types of systems already in place if you were managing a federal grant such as Department of Labor YouthBuild. And the second reason is that the survey serves as providing a baseline understanding for your assigned AmeriCorps financial manager. So your financial manager is going to be getting well acquainted with your support documentation, your accounting and general ledger, timesheets. So this survey is really going to give us a starting point prior to that monthly reimbursement process. So hopefully you had a chance to view and complete the survey. As I said, if you have yet to complete the survey, don't worry, your financial manager will reach out to notify you if there are any loose ends with fiscal grant startup for this current year. If you're looking for the survey template, we often do link to that in our emails, but you can find that with everything else on the resources webpage. So we'll continue to drop that link into the chat. And I'll just give a quick overview of what's in that survey and highlight the 5 sections. So up top, we're looking at your latest independent audit or single audit if you happen to meet that federal dollars threshold of, I believe, $750,000 in federal expenses a year. So our responsibility as the prime grantee is to make sure you are following up on any identified weaknesses in your internal controls. Next, written policies. We want to make sure you have the policies and procedures established and in place to meet the administrative requirements that are outlined in federal uniform guidance. Next, funds management. Some standard questions, just getting to know your financial and accounting systems. Section 4, some key compliance questions related to internal controls and essentially safeguarding funds. And then finally, match monitoring. So what is your process for budgeting, tracking, and documenting match? All right, so when it comes to our monitoring procedures and the focus of much of your interactions with your program's AmeriCorps financial manager, we are concerned with keeping things RAD. So not just RAD, but totally RAD. So RAD is our rule of thumb. It's part of our shared language. We always quiz folks on this acronym just to see if you're an AmeriCorps fiscal hotshot, if you've been to some past trainings, maybe have been managing the fiscal side for a while. So let's head over to the chat and go ahead and let us know if you know what RAD stands for. All right, we'll give a moment for some answers to pop in, waiting for our fiscal hotshots. We've got 1, responsible, allocable, and documented. All right. Or reasonable, yep. All right, reasonable, allocable, documented. All right, fiscal hotshots, I see you, I recognize you. So let's go through it together. So first up, we have reasonable. Is it necessary for the AmeriCorps grant objectives? Is it a prudent purchase? You know, would a taxpayer sort of approve of what is being utilized with the grant? Next up is allowable. So is it allowable under uniform guidance, AmeriCorps terms and conditions, and YouthBuild USA requirements. And just know you can find a list of all those expressly unallowable costs listed in the fiscal manual. Next, and one of my favorites, allocable. So is the fair share of the cost being allocated to the AmeriCorps grants? So is this a cost that benefits multiple funding sources, multiple cost objectives? And if so, is there a written cost allocation plan that explains the basis for how you consistently allocate those shared costs? And finally, documented. So do you have the paper trail and the source documentation to support these expenses? And another phrase you'll hear from the AmeriCorps team on both program and finance is this phrase, if it isn't documented, and we'll give a moment to the fiscal hotshots if you want to jump into the chat. Can anyone finish this phrase? If it isn't documented, blank. Thank you, Terry. Fiscal hotshot. I see you, I recognize you. All right, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. All right, so these are the cost principles defined in uniform guidance. And this is really our team's test for determining whether or not costs are in compliance. All right, so if you want a bit more information and support with either the survey or just how to understand our expectations around financial management, you can head over to the fiscal crash course and watch the financial management overview. That spends a bit more time going through these 5 sections of the survey. And once again, you can access the crash course via the resource webpage. All right, let's move over to grant expenditure period, or the period of time you can incur expenses under each of your AmeriCorps grant years. So in order to understand the expenditure period, you'll first need to know a bit about AmeriCorps member enrollments. So let's first define the member enrollment window for grant year 22-23. All right, so back to the chat, looking back to our fiscal hotshots. What is the enrollment period for the 22-23 AmeriCorps grant year? Looking for 2 dates. All right, hotshots, you're showing yourselves. Okay, the enrollment window, you've got it, is August 15th of 2022, is a year long, and then ends on August 14th, 2023. And then the next day would actually kick off the 23-24 grant year. All right, so this is the 1-year window of time in which members can be enrolled and tied to or associated with that specific grant year. All right, so the enrollment period is when members can be enrolled. Once enrolled, members have approximately a year to complete their service. And the length of time that your members are serving is going to determine when you can bill expenses and match to your AmeriCorps grants. So your program's individual grant expenditure period is not set in stone. It's going to be tied to member activity at your program. So I'll leave you with 2 rules of thumb just to help remember our grant expenditure period policy. First is money follows members, or in other words, the funds you are billing are associated with members who are actively serving under that particular grant year. So many AmeriCorps programs are managing multiple grant years at once. And second rule of thumb, remember this 30-day rule. So you can start incurring expenses 30 days prior to the first member enrolled under a grant year, and then all the way out until 30 days after the final member exits. All right, so this can be confusing for new programs, so let me provide a quick visual to help understand how this timeline works. So let's say, for example, we enroll our first member or member cohorts for this new grant year on October 4th, 2022. We apply that 30-day rule, count 30 days back, and then we can start billing as of September 4th. So as you gear up for this new grant year, you'll just want to keep an eye out for member enrollments, which essentially activates the expenditure period. And then you can start having staff reporting time on their timesheets and billing all your various operational expenses. There is an exception though, for tangible goods. So let's say you already purchased AmeriCorps service or safety gear back in August. Totally permissible in our policy, as we understand these goods, these tangible items are going to be used down the road when members eventually do enroll. So it's really just your staff time and your operational expenses that we want to tie to member activity. All right, so since every program's expenditure period is going to look different, there's some variables with member enrollments. We have included another video on the grant timeline included in the fiscal crash course. In this video, we'll walk through a few different scenarios and illustrate how this might impact something such as the reimbursement process. So if you're managing that monthly process, multiple grants, it'll give a better visual of that process. All right, so I have two key takeaways from my section. First, keep it rad, reasonable, allowable, allocable, and documented. And second, remember our phrase, money follows members. So remember to watch out for those first members under grant year 22-23, then count back 30 days and do the same for the end of the grant. So watch for the final member to exit the program for that grant year, and then you have an additional 30 days to wrap up expenses. All right, as promised, we have some winners to announce for the Find Felix the Fiscal Feline contest. And I'll actually be announcing two winners since one of our financial team members, Allison Oslin, is on parental leave. So congratulations to Dina Blakely at Job Point, Columbia, Missouri, and Jessica Gandini at Resource in Burlington, Vermont. So you can expect an email from me sometime this week on how to choose and claim your AmeriCorps prize. So congratulations to both of you. Thanks for finding Felix. And with that, I will turn it over to Teresa.
Thanks, Brandon. All right, let me get myself situated. Just one second. And Brandon, I'm going to ask you for technical support to make sure that we're showing correctly here. Okay, are we seeing the screen correctly?
Yep, all set.
All right. Okay, so hey everybody, my name is Teresa and I'm an AmeriCorps Financial Grants Manager. Welcome everyone. So I'm going to go over your AmeriCorps budget. So obviously, like Brandon said, we've all been talking about budgets recently as your deadline has just came up for the draft 22-23 budget. So you might be a little tired of talking about budgets and looking at them. And we're feeling that a little bit too, so don't worry. So that kind of brings me to my next point. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but I actually got, this is a real fortune that I received from my takeout order. And it says, adjust finances, make budgets to improve your standing. And I was a little offended by that. I'm a little, I know, right? But it may have felt a little passive aggressive, but it is really good advice. So yeah, we might have been talking about budgets and looking at a lot of them recently. So all that said, I'll be selective about the topics that I'm going to discuss today. I'm going to try and keep it simple and brief and hopefully informative. All right. So as you know, we have a newly updated financial management manual. I just dropped a link in there just a moment ago. We did send that manual to you via email, but just as easy to look at the other documentation that's provided at that link just down there. But the specific sections of that manual that pertain to budgets are the subgrantee budget policy, the subgrantee budget creation and modification process, and budget instructions. So those are the topics I'm going to discuss today. So as we just discussed a moment ago, here's our little buddy that we've been calling Felix. So after my thrilling discussion about budgets is over, I will reveal the winner from my portfolio who won the challenge. So before we get too far into the main topic, I just wanted to throw a poll out to you guys. It's always helpful for us to get more information about everybody's kind of experience level. So who here, like how much experience do you have creating or modifying the AmeriCorps budget? So the options are, I have no experience at all. I'm totally new to the process. B, I have some experience. And C, I have years of experience. I can do this in my sleep. Okay. D, okay, I see a lot of A's, B's. B's. Nobody's confident enough to say C yet? Okay, okay. Get a lot of A's and B's. Okay, that's cool. That's good to know. We really do appreciate that. Oh, I see you, Scott. Okay, you can do it in your sleep. Good. I got my eye on you. All right. So thank you, because it is really helpful, again, to get that information. And everyone expect perfect work from Scott from now on. All right. So let's talk about the subgrantee budget policy and requirements. Subgrantee, that's you, right? So programs typically build their first draft YouthBuild AmeriCorps budget prior to the start of each grant year. An Excel workbook template is provided, which includes program-specific info, such as grant award amount and member slots. So once that draft budget is prepared, the program's AmeriCorps financial manager, that's me, or Bethany, or Brandon, will review it to ensure that these costs are allowable and allocable, that there are no potential issues for non-compliance according to uniform guidance and the AmeriCorps terms and conditions. We also want to see that sources of match are clearly identified and are allowable. We also look to ensure that national service criminal history checks have been completed for all covered positions. And finally, we want to see that administrative costs are appropriately calculated and applied. So allowable costs, right? It's part of RAD, right? So what's an allowable cost? So to be an allowable cost, this cost has to be reasonable and budgeted for under the grant. It also has to comply with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, just in case you were tired of acronyms. I threw another one in there for you. It also has to comply with uniform guidance. An allowable cost cannot be charged against any other grant. The cost has to be treated consistently with other costs incurred. And finally, an allowable cost has to be documented, right? If it's not documented, it didn't happen. It's not real. All right, allocable costs. So allocations should be based on actual costs and on the principles of equity and reasonableness. It is incurred specifically for AmeriCorps or the AmeriCorps program if it benefits both the program and other work, if it is distributed fairly between the grant and other funding sources, and if it's necessary to the overall administration of the program. All right, sub-grantee share. That's you guys, the match share. Okay, so I've got a quick question for you all. If the AmeriCorps portion of the budget is $75,000, what is the amount of match the subgrantee is responsible for? Let's throw it into the chat. Who's got an answer for me? Okay, I've got crickets so far. There we go. I see you. Okay, Anne, thank you. Dana, yes. Jessica, okay, great. $75,000. That is perfect. You guys are geniuses and total rock stars. All right. So match contributions, including third-party in-kind, must be verifiable in your records. They also should not be included as contributions for any other federally assisted programs. They must be necessary and reasonable for the proper and efficient accomplishment of the program's objectives, and they must all be allowable under applicable Office of Management and Budget cost principles. All right, exciting topic alert, right? So national service criminal history checks for covered positions. So YouthBuild USA staff confirm clearance dates for all covered positions prior to the approval of reimbursement requests. Staff include the clearance dates in the approved AmeriCorps budget, expense and match worksheets, and the monthly staff summary. So what that means is the financial grants manager enters in that data. So please do not enter that information in yourselves. Sometimes workbooks can be sent or left unlocked. And if that is the case, please do not alter that section. We can take care of it. It's also important to know that per the reimbursement review checklist, staff costs are not permitted if they occur prior to the National Service Criminal History Check clearance date. Okay, so let's go over that check. So National Service Criminal History checks are comprised of three searches and 4 key steps. Those 3 searches are the National Sex Offender Registry search, the state of service, state or residency criminal record search, the FBI fingerprint-based search, and when that's done, the documented adjudication and eligibility determination needs to be made. So to someone new, this sounds simple enough, but between these 4 steps, there's a lot of little steps. So it's important to keep in mind that permissions for these searches need to be obtained. You need to spell the person's legal name just as it appears on their ID. And there also needs to be a process for challenging the results of the search. So a member of the AmeriCorps team has identified about 12 ways to make a mistake in completing this process and documenting it. So if a mistake is made, it means that it's a non-compliant National Service Criminal History check, and that equals disallowed costs for salaries or for member living allowances. Not good, no bueno. So this is the ideal situation. Staff is hired and the NSCHC is completed before grant work has started. A budget modification is requested and documentation for the NSCHC check is sent to YouthBuild USA to review. The National Service Criminal History checks are reviewed and budget modification is approved. The reimbursement request is prepared and sent, and request is approved and the program is reimbursed. Yay, right? That's what we want to see. So like I said, this is an ideal situation, of course, but there are situations that we definitely want to avoid. Here's what we want to avoid. This less than ideal situation. New staff is hired and starts work, and the National Service Criminal History check is not completed. The reimbursement request with the new staff hours expensed is sent to the FM for review, and the reimbursement is rejected by the FM, Financial Grants Manager. So then the check is completed and the documents are sent and reviewed by YouthBuild USA. And then finally, YouthBuild USA will then review the reimbursement and approve the ARR. So this is an ideal, right? So we want to avoid gaps between when staff starts and when the check is run, because any gaps like that will have to be charged to another funder, and that's not ideal. We want to avoid large gaps between when program requests reimbursements and when they are reimbursed. We also want to avoid extra work for you guys and ourselves to redo the reimbursement request and to review it. So I'm going to kind of go through a common scenario that we've seen pretty often. So what might happen is that a program will input the new staff's name and National Service Criminal History check date in the workbook themselves. We notice that there's a new name on there, and that starts the process, our internal process for verifying that National Service Criminal History check date internally, and that's mid-reimbursement review. So this is not preferable because it definitely disrupts the review process. But if this kind of thing goes unnoticed by your financial grants manager for a while, reimbursements can be approved that include that staff's hours with unverified national service criminal history check clearance dates. So that's not great. So what we'll have to do, even if we trust the program or the people at the program to not include time before the clearance dates, we still have to go back and check to see if the staff's time was reimbursed before the clearance dates. So it's a lot of backtracking and a lot of you having to wait to get paid. We don't want to have to do that. Okay, so this can be a confusing topic. Luckily, this is reviewed in the AmeriCorps Fiscal Crash Course video series. All right, next let's talk some basics, right? Budget creation basics. So each line item of your budget is capped off by these 3 sections you can see here. And it's important to understand how they function so you can complete your budget correctly. So as you can see, these 3 sections are total amount, expense, and match. The total amount should reflect what is reported by you in the line item, including any calculations you present. Please note that you should round this section to the nearest dollar. Okay, so this next section, expense. So the expense section is manually filled out by you. And that should be for the portion that of the total amount that you wish to bill to AmeriCorps. And then finally, we'll see the match section. So match calculations automatically determined by subtracting expense from total amount. So subtracting the second from the first. And that is done automatically through a formula. So nobody from the program should be altering this section or manipulating it in any way. It's not necessary. It just does it all by itself. So please don't. But if you are having trouble with any of these kind of sections of Excel, we are here for technical support, and we'd be happy to help you if you reach out. All right, so I'll talk about budgeting match. So match is back, right? We all know that. So I bring this up for that reason, and also because in going through the 22-23 draft budgets, the match section is sometimes left blank or missing some key details. So I'd like to go over it a little bit for you guys. So match sources should be listed at the bottom of your budget and should be labeled accurately and clearly. You should always use the full name of the funder in the name of source section rather than the name of a grant or any other identifying detail. So remember to label it as cash or in kind, and then label the source type. The purpose of match should be clear and descriptive, and the sources of match listed here should tie directly to the reference sections in the budget. So also remember, and we said this a couple times now, but federal awards are not allowed to be used as match. And the onus is on the subgrantee to confirm that any state grant being used is not federal pass-through money. All right, budget creation, the calculations edition. So for budget calculation and purpose sections of the budget, it's all about detail. We love to see it. We love details. So please provide specific details for equations in the calculation fields whenever possible. So you can use the purpose field or parentheses wherever to elaborate. So as you can see in this example, the purpose field shows that AmeriCorps safety gear is for safety glasses and earplugs. And the calculation shows that the cost is $10, $8 for glasses and $2 for earplugs, and that's for 30 members. That's great. So there's a lot of detail that's provided here, and that isn't always necessary or even possible, but if you can, whenever possible, please just use as much detail wherever you can. Estimations are also fine, but if you use them, please specify where they're made. So in this example, utilities, you can see that the estimation is based off of previous monthly costs, and that's fine. Just please note that. So utilities brings me to my next point. Occupancy costs, like rent and utilities. So if space is budgeted and is shared with other projects or activities, it has to be, the cost must be equitably prorated and allocated between those activities or projects. So in this example, we can see that the AmeriCorps contribution is 40%, right? So for rent, 40% is $1,000 a month, and that's for 12 months. So please also note that you can see the total amount that's for rent that is pre-AmeriCorps allocation, that's $2,500. All right. So we really only touched on budget creation briefly, as you've all been through this process pretty recently. However, if you need it, the budget creation process is detailed carefully in the AmeriCorps Fiscal Crash Course. And budget creation is daunting and can be a headache for sure. But remember that a budget is just a plan, right? So obviously we all want cohesive and comprehensive plans that work smoothly and cover everything. But sometimes something happens and your plan has to change. That's okay. We can make a budget modification. So budget modification is something we might encounter more frequently than budget creation. So just remember that the subgrantee must obtain approval from YouthBuild USA prior to incurring costs for budget line items, not initially included in the approved budget. Okay, so budget modifications facilitated for a bunch of reasons. So it could be to incorporate new staff or line items. It could be to reallocate or allocate an increase or decrease in funding. You might want to amend sources of match, or spending is over the 10% threshold of over budgeted budget subsections. That's a mouthful, right? But I'm going to use an example to elaborate. So who wants to tell me what this picture is of here? You can say it in the chat, or you can come off mute if you'd like. Crickets. Okay. Okay. All right. That's fine. I'll describe it myself. So what we're seeing here is a picture of the expense worksheet. It's on the far right where you can see all of, there we go. There we go. That's great. Okay. So now you guys are trained. Okay. Okay. Cool. I love you guys. Love this. Okay. Okay, so yes, so we're looking at the expense worksheet and you can see the actual budget amounts and the overages, right? And this is in the very far right of your expense workbook. So if you're seeing a lot of these red numbers, it's indicating that the category or that category is overspent and it might be time for budget modification. This example is a hypothetical budget of $195,000. So that's AmeriCorps and the match portions combined. And the values in red are overages in each subcategory, and they add up to more than 10% of that $195,000 budget. So this is a complicated subject, and if you think you might be nearing this point or will need a budget modification, or you've already passed this point, that's fine. Just reach out to your financial grants manager, and we can start that process along. And here's how that process will work. This is our general administrative workflow for this process. So when we are going to make a budget modification, the first step is that the subgrantee, that's you, notifies the AmeriCorps Financial Grants Manager, that's me, via email with the reason for the budget modification, as well as a copy of the most recent AmeriCorps Reimbursement Workbook. The modification will take place within the most recent workbook to include year-to-date expenses. The second step is the AmeriCorps Financial Grants Manager prepares the budget for alteration, and then they'll send that unlocked version of the most recent approved budget to the subgrantee, that's you. So the subgrantee will make necessary modifications to the budget and send links to the budget worksheet to the AmeriCorps Financial Grants Manager once it's complete, or you can send it in an attachment in an email, that's fine as well. And then the final step, the AmeriCorps Financial Grants Manager will review, and they may provide feedback or request further revisions prior to approving the budget. And after it's approved, we can resume reimbursements completely as normal. All right. Oh. All right. So here are some key takeaways, because I've talked a lot. So, and really quickly. So let's just go over it a little bit. So please tell us about new staff before reimbursement requests, including their time are sent. Remember that YouthBuild USA has an internal process to verify national service criminal history check dates and to enter them into the necessary documents. Also, remember that budget modification processes should start with notifying your financial grants manager first. If you know the precise modification that you want to make and you know how to do it, that's great. But you still have to notify us first to start that process and facilitate it. Finally, please be as detailed as possible with information within the budget. So that should include the purpose, calculations, position descriptions, and sources of match. And feel free to ask any questions whenever you need to. If we don't know the answer right away, we always just ask Brandon first, but if we don't have an answer right away, we'll research it and we'll do some troubleshooting for you. That's what we're here to do. And obviously we're really happy to do it. So this brings me to my final point this afternoon, what I'm super excited to share with you. The Fiscal Cat Challenge. All right, so who among my portfolios found the team and was randomly assigned this cat? Okay, so it was Amy from Fort Worth. All right, everybody, congratulations, Amy. Like Brandon said, I'll reach out to you separately to kind of facilitate that. We'll figure out your sizes. Yeah, Amy, congrats. So yeah, I'll reach out to you this week. We can talk about that a little bit further. All right, so thanks everybody for spending this time with me. I hope this provided some helpful information, and I'm going to pass it to Bethany now. She's going to talk to you about reimbursements.
Thanks, Teresa. Give me a second to get queued up. Okay, can folks give me a thumbs up if you are seeing my screen? Awesome. Okay. So as Teresa said, I'm going to be covering the reimbursement process. So I want to highlight some of the resources that are in our manual. I'll also give a very brief overview of the process, both the process that YouthBuild USA goes through, and then the process that the program will go through in order to prepare, submit, review, and approve a reimbursement request. I also have some best practices, which I will go over at the end. Okay, so what's new to the manual? We have consolidated all these resources that you've had access to in the past. They're in one place, and we encourage you to look at them even if you have been working on the grant for a while. We have expanded sections and we've added clarifying language. And if you are new to the grant, there's so many steps to this process, and everything that you need is here. So be sure to make use of it. All right. The policy with respect to how YouthBuild USA approaches the reimbursement process is that we will reimburse you for expenses that relate to the approved budget that have been incurred on a monthly basis and that are in accordance with the reporting and payment schedule in your contract. So YouthBuild USA will not advance funds, however, and we also won't reimburse folks for unallowed expenses or without proper source documentation, right? If it's not documented, it didn't happen. Now, when you submit the request to us, this is what we do on our end. First, your financial manager will review your materials. We're looking to see that those expenditures are consistent with the budget and that they are RAD. Now, if along the way we discover any issues, the financial manager will halt the review and they'll reach out to you, the program, typically to request clarification and sometimes corrections. Once all those issues have been resolved, the FM, like we can review the request and, we can approve it, and then it moves on to payment processing. Payment works like this. Programs receive funds electronically through invoice pay. And this happens typically 30 days after the receipt of an accurate and complete reimbursement submission. If we have to move into the revision phase, that will slow this timeline down a bit. When it comes to cash flow problems, we recommend you try to avoid it by keeping your payment schedule in mind. However, if it is unavoidable, just reach out to your FM as soon as possible and we'll help you. Okay, so that's our end. On your end, we want you to think of the reimbursement request process as having 3 steps. So the first step is that you will report on any expenses that you'd like to charge to the grant, and you'll do that through a reimbursement workbook. Once you've completed all your reports, you then gather documentation to support those expenses. And then finally, pause and review your submission before you send it to us. So let's look a little bit more closely at these steps. The fiscal manual does have a section devoted to each of these 3 steps: report, support, and review. So this is our table of contents. And right here, this contains instructions for reporting, how to complete the workbook. Then once you move on and you're trying to gather your support documentation, you can head to this section of the manual. It's a great guidance for typical documentation for typical expenses. And then lastly, there's a review checklist in the manual. There's also a review checklist in your workbook, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so the workbook, this is where all your reporting happens. So let's take a minute to just go over some basics here. It has all the templates that you need. It's located in your program's Dropbox folder. So each program will get a new reimbursement workbook for each new grant year once your budget has been approved. So for some folks who are here today, you are getting very close to getting your new reimbursement workbook, or you're almost there because your budget is almost approved. Now, within the workbook itself, you have all of these multiple tabs, and they're sequenced so that when you complete one tab, you'll be completing a report, and then those numbers will populate into a subsequent tab. And it culminates in, once you've completed the whole workbook, is a summary of the reimbursement request. So our tabs include your approved budget, and Teresa just covered with you how to go about that. We then have a staff summary tab. So this is a template that helps you determine the correct allocation of personnel expenses to the AmeriCorps grant. And what it will do is it'll calculate those expenses based on the allocation of hours worked on the grant by each individual employee. And it's linked to the budget. There's a tab for the member living allowance summary. However, that only applies to you if you have full-time members and you are paying them a stipend. Then we have tabs for a monthly expense report and a match report. These are also linked to the budget and the staff summary. The expense report is where you're going to enter all the expenses for which you're seeking reimbursement in that month. And then match is where you're reporting on your expenses. And then lastly is this consolidation of all the reports and all the information that you've entered. This is called the financial status report, or the FSR. And it creates just a one-page overview of the reimbursement request. After you've completed your reporting, it's time to gather that documentation. There's a couple of key things that you're going to need to include, and I'll itemize them here, but please understand that there's actually a lot of nuance to the type of documentation that's needed, and so the manual will get into this in more depth. But everyone needs to submit a transaction level AmeriCorps general ledger. We need to have personnel compensation documentation. So this takes the form of payroll registers, time and attendance records. We need documentation to verify that the member living allowance has been paid, if that's applicable to your program. And then lastly, a rather large category, but source documentation for all other transaction types. So this is particularly the place where you can go and check out the manual to find out more about that type of documentation. If we don't have the correct required documentation, we can't reimburse you for those expenses. Lastly, check your work. You have your reports, your support documentation gathered. Pause and go over the self-review checklist that is in the workbook, and it's also in the manual. If you have been doing the grant for a long time, we still encourage you to pause and use the checklist just to slow yourself down. Sometimes folks are having a busy day and they overlook a detail, and that slows down the review process. And if you're new to the grant, as some of you are today, if these steps or requirements seem a little overwhelming, that's okay too. You aren't expected to know them or have them memorized. That's why we have the checklist. And of course, that's why we're here too. You can reach out to us. All right, you've reviewed everything, you're ready to go. This is what needs to be sent to us on Dropbox. First of all, don't forget the workbook itself. We need the current living version of the workbook. So if you're submitting a request for the month of December, that workbook needs to be up to date and through December. That's the version that we need. We also need a signed FSR. So as I mentioned, the FSR is the last tab in the workbook. We need folks to actually print it and sign the bottom of it, and then upload it to us as a PDF. That's the only part of the reimbursement workbook that we really require that you print and send separately. But don't forget the signed FSR. If it's not signed, we have to pause the review process and reach out to you for a correction. All your support documentation also goes up here, and you can see all these handy PDFs labeled clearly so that we know what we're looking at. And then once everything's on Dropbox, reach out to us, send me an email, send Teresa or Brandon an email to let us know that your reimbursement request is there. And at that point, we'll get started on the review. So we have a fiscal crash course video on the reimbursement request that really slows down what I've just kind of breezed through here, particularly slowing down and looking at each tab in the reimbursement workbook to help you understand how to complete those reports. So we highly recommend that you look at that. For example, some of these workbook tabs, these can be places where we often have to pause the review process and reach out for clarification if there's a discrepancy between the report and the support documentation, like the staff summary. So take a look at the crash course video because it really walks you through that. All right. Next, let's talk about best practices. So I've covered policy and process. These are things that aren't necessarily in the manual, but that we think would be helpful for you to know. We know that you want a revision-free, smooth reimbursement request process. We do too. These are some things that can help make the process smoother. So think about this as making it as easy as possible for your financial manager to understand the request. So if you can imagine, we each, that is your FMs, we each have about 20 programs or so that we manage. And that means 20 different financial systems to understand, styles for naming documents, just the look of files and systems is different across our 20 programs. And so when we get into your reimbursement requests, they all look quite different. So if you can help us by making it easy for us to locate your request, to identify the documents or files that you've sent us, and then make it possible for us to actually read and search those files, and then finally help us understand the allocation of costs to the grant. If you can hit those 4 points and making it easy for us, it's going to be a smoother process. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. So first, easy to locate. We share files through Dropbox, and we like this because it generally allows for some fairly easy sharing between you and between us so that we can locate files quickly without having to send each other materials as attachments through email. That gets really confusing. So first, if you are new to the grant, be sure that you have access to Dropbox. If you don't know if you have access to Dropbox, that's okay too. You can reach out to us or someone at your program for help. You need to have access to it and editing privileges. Now, Some folks here today know Dropbox can be finicky. So sometimes programs will say, hey, I've uploaded my material, and we say, where? We can't see it on Dropbox. So we're going to pause here and take a poll. So there are two ways that you can get to Dropbox. You can get to Dropbox through your browser. So you go to Internet Explorer, you type in www.dropbox.com, and what you see on your screen should look like the browser view here and the image at the bottom of the slide. However, if you use the desktop app to get to Dropbox, then what you see on your screen is going to resemble the image up here in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, the app view. So let's take a moment and, no, we don't want to do that. We want to do a poll. I don't think I know how to do a poll. Brandon, I'm not seeing it.
Yep, I can launch that for you.
Okay, thanks. So what we'd like to know is, based on the images that I've just shared with you or what you know of your process, which version of Dropbox do you use? Do you get to it through your browser, through the web, or do you get to it through an app on your desktop? And we are very curious to get a sense of how folks approach this. Okay, lots of folks using, looks like more folks using the web version than the desktop version. That's interesting. All right. So it looks like 61% of you are accessing it through the web, and then 30% through the desktop app, and then one person says, I have no idea, and that's okay too. Dropbox can be new to some of us. All right, that's helpful. Thank you for filling out the poll. So why does this matter? Interestingly, we recommend folks use the desktop app because the browser version, the web version, can be finicky sometimes, and oftentimes file sharing isn't as intuitive. So for example, if you're using the app version and we're sharing an Excel file, it's easy enough to just open, modify the document, and then alert someone to the changes. If you and I are sharing the reimbursement workbook through, and you're accessing it through the browser, you won't be able to open that workbook and make changes in it. You'll have to download it, save it to your desktop, make changes, and send it back to us. So these extra steps that can slow us down, and sometimes we might even think, I can't access the files that I'm sharing with you or that you've sent to me. So if at all possible, we encourage you to try to use the app version. If you can't use the app version for whatever reason, that's okay as well. But just know that the browser version, if we have any miscommunication, just reach out to us. That's typically why there's a discrepancy there. Lastly, about Dropbox, we do have a crash course video on it, and it's very helpful. I actually watched it a few times to make sure that I understood Dropbox. So I encourage you to take a look at it. All right, easy to identify. When we're looking at your reimbursement request, something that your FM does is we have to compare the reports you created with the support documentation that you've sent us. So on the screen, you see pictures of key reports from the reimbursement workbook. We have the FSR, the expense report, and the staff summary. We only require folks to submit the FSR as a separate file, but if possible, could you please create separate files of the expense worksheet and the staff summary? This makes it easier for us to locate that staff summary and start to compare it with the time and attendance records, or to pull up the expense worksheet and start checking off invoices as we find them. This is very helpful to us. Not required, but helpful. So let's talk for a moment about what happens if files aren't easy to identify. Imagine that this is my Dropbox folder and I'm going to review your materials, and I need to find your expense report and your FSR. If the file names look like this, I'm not quite sure where to go to find the FSR. So a file name like 621 Financial doesn't really tell me what I would be getting if I opened up that PDF. Or a file named 932121 YBGC SFE June, I also don't know what that is. You as a program have your own internal shorthand and style for naming files. And while we understand that it would be helpful to us if you would rename the files when you send them to us, rename them when they get to Dropbox. So something like this is much easier for your financial manager to get into the Dropbox folder and start the review. There are fewer acronyms, letters, numbers, and the names match the names that we use in the manual or in our crash course videos. So FSR, for example, is here. Easy to read. If your PDFs are blurry, that really slows everything down. It's our job to scrutinize every letter, every number, every decimal point. So if the PDF is blurry, then we have to pause the review and reach out to you, or we squint like this for a really long time. Just make sure the resolution on your files is crystal clear before you send them to us. If your PDF is filled with pages going in 100 different directions, that can also slow us down. If it's not too much trouble, take a moment to rotate the pages, save the file, and send it to us that way. Easy to understand. So we have to determine that expenses have been fairly allocated to the grant. So we need to be able to tell how you've arrived at your calculations. If we don't understand it, we can't approve it. So here's an example of how a program has made it easy for us to understand the allocation of PTO to the grant. You see here a timesheet. The timesheet has a handy key at the bottom, which has a calculation and helps me understand how the program is determining how much PTO is charged to AmeriCorps. This type of support documentation connects to the staff summary, and I am able to understand the report because of this helpful key that the program has provided to me. If your timesheet or timekeeping methods, of course, do not have a key, not everyone's does, you can always put a handwritten note in there for us. That's extremely helpful. This is another example of how a program has just taken one additional step to make it easy for us to understand their allocation method. This is a cover sheet to an expense. And as you can see, there's a section toward the bottom where programs have all the different funders laid out, and they're just circling funders to help identify how that expense is being billed. In this case, you can see the program has made some adjustments, and this expense is being billed to AmeriCorps entirely. However, in the event that they did have a shared expense that was split, they could very easily circle and make that visible to us in our review. Easy to search. This is a picture of an expense worksheet, and you can see that there's a line item here for safety gear for $1,735.25. My job is to go through the support documentation and see if I can verify that number. If I have 30 different receipts of in the support documentation, I have to sort of do quite a lot of calculation and detective work to figure out if that can if that adds up. So this program has created a cover sheet to their supply source documentation section. And what's great here, if you can see, is they have made a connection for me and broken down that $1,735 into a series of expenses. And I can simply go through the support documentation and start to check it off that way. So it's a very helpful way to for the FM to be able to locate what they need to locate and verify your expenses. So this is another helpful part of the process that folks could implement or emulate if you wanted to create a smoother review, especially if you're sending in a lot of receipts. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about easy to identify. I talked about it mostly with respect to your reports and your files, but something we've also found is that it can be hard to identify you, our fiscal contacts. And a lot of this occurs around abbreviations and email. That's how we mostly communicate with each other. So all of us, ourselves included, use shorthand to talk about our job positions, our programs, the departments that we work in, but it can make it difficult to communicate outside of our own workspaces. So for example, if you got a message like this from me, maybe my name wasn't on it, it just said, hi, it's YBUSA, AMC, FGM. You might not know off the top of your head who's sending you this message. Maybe you do, but likely you don't. That's going to be pretty confusing. There's no context. However, if my message said this, hi, it's your YouthBuild AmeriCorps Financial Grants Manager, that's a little easier for you to wrap your head around. So I want to take a moment and have you all pop into the chat and just type in your program name's abbreviation, the acronym that you use. I suspect that many of us use acronyms. And I don't have a view of the chat. If somebody could let me know what we're seeing.
Seeing a lot of letters.
A lot of
I
letters.
see LACC, I see CHYBA, FYB.
A lot of letters. Okay. So if you can see the chat, I can't, but if you can see all those letters, imagine that that is your inbox. So as I said, I have about 20 programs, and if I'm just getting a wall of letters in my inbox, then it's very difficult for me to identify, oh, this is whose request has just come in. So here's a best practice. Let's all speak the same language when we speak to each other and try to identify ourselves. We identify programs at YouthBuild USA by your city name. So YB Boston, YB Denver. This is what our files look like. And so if you could also refer to yourself when you send me an email by your city name as opposed to your program name, that would be helpful. Programs all have really lovely names. They're specific, they're thoughtful, but those names can change, and also sometimes they can be really long, which is why we use the city name. So if I see a message that says YBDMEC is ready, as you can see, it doesn't match up to our file naming system. You might send me something that's more specific, like YouthBuild Dunder Mifflin Electric City is ready. That's more helpful. I could Google that to figure out where you are, or I could dig through a bunch of spreadsheets to find that out. It's not readily apparent in our naming system. It's a great name, but I can't really match it. This one works. So YB Scranton, PA is ready. There we go. I can go immediately to your folder, your file, find you and review your material. So if possible, let's speak the same language when it comes to talking with each other through email. Okay, key takeaways, this whole reimbursement process overview. Stay organized and be thorough. There's lots of little steps. You aren't expected to memorize them. Probably shouldn't. Always refer to the manual. Love the manual. It is your friend. Read it many times. Never let it go. And then there's also us, your financial managers. Please reach out to us. We are more than happy to help you and answer any questions. And I'll plug our crash course videos again. The reimbursement request video does this in a lot more detail. All right, and lastly, finding Felix. So in my portfolio, the fiscal folk who found Felix will be Janelle DeWild. Congratulations, Janelle, from Heart of Oregon, sisters. I will be reaching out to you this week to connect and get you linked up with your reward. Congratulations. I'm going to turn things back over to Brandon. He's got some final thoughts for us.
Yep. Thanks, Bethany. And thanks to all you for joining us today. This concludes today's broadcast. So we will follow up with a communication just providing you with a recording of today's webinar and a copy of the slide deck. So as we've been mentioning throughout this webinar, we encourage you all to utilize the 3 resources we've been discussing. So the updated financial manual, the updated fiscal crash course, which is the video playlist on YouTube, and finally, your AmeriCorps Financial Manager. So as you're working to get 22-23 organized, please reach out with any questions along the way. And stay tuned for future webinars. You can likely expect our next webinar sometime in early February for our next touch point. So enjoy the rest of your day and take care, everyone.